So I wanted to just say, one thing that a lot of people get interested about is the idea of near-death experiences. So I've actually had, 12. And the funny thing is, the first three I couldn't remember until I was about 12. So the first one that I remembered very clearly was when I was 6. But I actually had one when I was 18 months old and two when I was 5. But it was really strange that I couldn't remember them. So why I couldn't remember those first three, at least in part, was because I didn't remember very much of my first 6 years of life. Not sure why. This is just, I don't think it's really trying to suppress memories or anything. It's just a normal thing that people often can't remember much of their early childhood. And I could remember bits and pieces, and I've worked out that I could probably remember about 3 months out of my first 6 years of life. And then since my 6th birthday, so I turned 6, I could remember almost everything. There's probably a few small gaps after I was 6, but not very much. And by the time I was 9 or 10, I could remember very close to 100% of it. And in fact, since I was probably 13 or 14, I think I can remember absolutely 100%. And the reason why I can say with quite certainty that I can remember absolutely everything since I was about 14 is because everything feels like it was yesterday. Everything from when I was 14, when I was 13, when I was 15, when I was 16, feels like it happened last week. And I have to sort of piece things together to sort of work out when they happen, in which order, and so forth. And I don't know if that's the case for everybody, but certainly if I look at things that happened when I was 9 or 10, they feel like they were in the past. But if I look at things that happened even when I was 15 or 14, they feel like they just happened last week. And that tells me things that happened just last week, I'm remembering 100% of. And things that happened in the past, I'm probably missing a little bit of. And things that happened when I was 6 do feel like a long time ago. And I can almost say that there's probably 4, maybe 5 stages in my life as far as my memory is concerned. So I remember almost nothing of my first 18 months, maybe like 3 days worth, and I could go over which bits I remember. And then from 18 months to about 6, I remember, maybe 3 months out of that, and it's very patchy, very little. And in fact, later on, I had other people that could remember things more clearly, helped me to remember bits that I'd forgotten. And from about 6 until about I actually think 6 until about 8 or 9, I remembered a little bit more, maybe 75%. And then from about 9 until about 13 or 14, it was probably more closer to 90%. And then I think from there, it may as well be 100%. If there are gaps, and I've had people try to convince me that I've forgotten things, but then I've been able to check and I hadn't. I'd forgotten nothing. Gosh, I remember going out to nightclubs and such and have a few drinks, and my friend would say, "Oh, you've forgotten this. Oh, this happened, this happened, this happened." And I believed him. I thought it had memory gaps. But then I hadn't. And he just pretended. He just rewrote my memory. And there's people that have tried to do that at different times. I think you call that gaslighting. So I have had people try to gaslight me at different points. So yeah, so I'm gonna stick with the first one that I clearly remembered at the time, which happened when I was 6 years old. So what happened on this one is that at that time, and it was 1981, kids, well, it was different to what it is now. So I was 6 years old and I was at my grandparents' place. We were living with my grandparents by that point. And we had a trampoline. And I'm trying to think of how many kids we had. We probably had around 12 or 15 kids there. And different ages. So probably up to about 12 and probably down to about 3 or 4. And everywhere in between. And basically what happened was that the bigger kids got on the trampoline and the smaller kids got under the trampoline. So it was sort of, the cutoff was about 8. And if you were over 8, you bounced on the trampoline. We had 4 or 6 people at once, which you wouldn't have today. That wouldn't be allowed, but quite normal at the time. And I'll just for people's might not be aware, at the time, people were really worried about the impact of televisions. We didn't have computers then, that wasn't relevant. And we didn't have mobile phones, that was not until much later. But people worried about the impact of television. So parents were encouraged to get their kids to play outside. And so we were doing the right thing by playing outside, even though it was extremely dangerous what we were doing, because that was considered to be better than sitting inside watching TV. It might seem weird doing that now, but that was the push at the time. The television really started to hit off in the mid to late 1970s, at least here in Australia. And by 1981, there was a push to get kids to play outside. We actually weren't supposed to be reading either. Reading was considered to be bad. We were told, play outside, no matter how dangerous it was. So there were a lot of kids that died from this attitude that you can't be watching TV. So they went outside, they played these dangerous games, much more dangerous than they had in, let's say, the early 1970s. And some people would be playing hockey in the middle of the road, a car would come by and kill somebody. So we had a lot of things, and I knew kids that had died from going outside because we're all told not to watch TV. We were told to go outside. So we really pushed going outside. Because there was a later push to get kids back to reading. And then nowadays, I think it's probably more go inside and don't go outside. But certainly that was at the time. Parents were told, don't let your kids watch TV for more than 30 minutes a week. That was sort of the cutoff. And, you know, that's one show. So you'd pick one show, one TV show per week, and for a lot of kids it was Play School or Sesame Street. And that was all we were allowed to watch for the whole week. I actually went a bit higher than that. I actually got 30 minutes a day, sometimes even an hour a day. I get to watch Play School and Sesame Street. And then I get to watch the morning cartoons on Saturday morning as well. So that was probably about another hour and a half, 2 hours. So I was probably up around 4 hours, 4.5 hours. Wow! You know, per week, that's such a lot. But nonetheless, I was outside playing underneath the trampoline. And we probably had 4 to 6 older kids on top of the trampoline at once. And this trampoline was quite a big one, but it was meant to be for one person at a time. And so we'd have 4 to 6 at a time. Granted, they were kids, but even with kids, 2 is pretty much the most you could ever do. And then we had about another 6 to 8 underneath the trampoline. And these were mostly younger kids. And basically what we did underneath the trampoline is that we would kick the people who had their feet. So we'd lie back on our backs and just kick it, or sometimes we punch it. Of course we weren't hurting them, but it just sort of felt weird. Sort of they'd jump down, sometimes they'd just be oh my God, sometimes they'd just be standing on the trampoline and we sort of punch them with our tiny little fists or our tiny little feet. So we had our shoes off, socks off, you know, and it was a summer day and that's what we were doing. So I did that, and at one point I felt a little sting, felt like a pin was pushed in me. And it sort of smarted and I went, ow. Of course I didn't know what it was. Could have been, well, a number of things. I mean, my first thought was, somebody left like a thumbtack underneath the trampoline and I'd trodden on it. So it was on my toe. And I thought there'd been a thistle or something like that. So I went to get a Band-Aid. I wasn't in any big rush, so I waited until people had stopped jumping up and down, waited about 10 minutes, and then went out to get a Band-Aid. It was bleeding. And we went to get a Band-Aid. And so I was 6 and I was quite a small kid. And quite skinny, quite short. So I wasn't a big 6-year-old. I'm not sure how much I weighed or how tall I was, but I wasn't big. Anyway, I wasn't anorexic. I was a bit later, but not at that stage. Not quite. I was fairly close to anorexic, so I was quite a small kid. So I went inside and my grandmother was there, and so she washed my toe, and then she noticed that my foot was starting to swell up. So she thought that I'd got in contact with something like poison ivy sort of thing. And so she put some caramel lotion on me, and then she gave me a bath. So she thought, oh, this is not even really an allergic reaction, but just a normal reaction to some poison, grass, whatever. And so that's what she did, and gave me a bath. And the bath wasn't really working. So I think it was somewhere like about half an hour to an hour, might have been 2 hours. I was sitting in the bath, she'd scrub, she'd try different things, and it wasn't working. So my mum, I don't know where she was before that, but, in those days, parents just left kids to their own thing. We could go on adventures together. Parents didn't even care. We could just go off for hours on end. And they were told that they were responsible parents by doing this. So this wasn't parents doing the wrong thing. They were all told to do this. They were all told, television is the enemy. Get them out there playing. No matter how dangerous it is, they'll be fine. They'll survive. So my mum wasn't doing the wrong thing. Police weren't upset with her or anything like that. But so she came out and she was like, what is he doing in the bath? Told my grandmother off, and then looked at me and was like, oh my goodness, I had welts all over. It was swelling up all over my arms and legs and my body. And she remembered that my dad and my grandfather had quite serious bee sting reactions. The funny thing was I'd actually been stung by a bee before that, and it swelled up a little bit more than it would for most people, but it wasn't dangerous. This one seemed to be much more serious. So they did that, and Mum took me to hospital. She got me to put some clothes on and took me to hospital. Now, I was on the way to the hospital when I lost consciousness. So we were in the car. We didn't get an ambulance. We were in the car, and I lost consciousness. Now, I was still aware of what was going on, because I still had a little bit of consciousness, perhaps, I couldn't keep my eyes open, but I sort of could still hear them. My mum was there, Granny was there. I don't think my sister was there, but she might have been. I think she was left with the kids to make sure that the other kids from whatever houses were okay playing on the trampoline. So she was babysitting. And she was all of like 10 years old. So she was babysitting. Some of the kids were older than her. But yeah, that was sort of what we did in those days. The older kids babysat the younger kids. You could be 8 years old and be babysitting. You could only babysit like 2-year-olds. It was sort of like, as long as someone's 3 or 4 years older, they're allowed to babysit. There's no minimum age for babysitting. So my sister would babysit us when she was 10 and we were like, I was 6 and other kids were 8 or 9. Some of them were older than her. But my sister used to, she'd beat us up. So, if we got out of line, she'd just punch us. And she did it not just to me, but to other boys and girls. And, you'd often be babysat by bullies. Older kids that would just like to bash you up. And, sometimes for big groups, we had more than one babysitter. And they were almost always bullies. And they'd beat us up. They didn't try to kill us. Sometimes they did try to kill us, but it was more just physical violence and threats and intimidation, and we control things. And that was certainly my experience with child babysitters, if you like. The adult babysitters didn't do that. A fairly big difference between adult babysitters who never hurt us compared to child babysitters that beat us up all the time. And I know some people say, oh, you can't have adult babysit, they're so dangerous. Certainly can't have men. I'm sorry, having someone like my sister was much worse. Anyway, that's just my experience. But so we went there, and Yeah, so I pretty much lost consciousness in the car on the way to the hospital. And I'm trying to think how far away the hospital was, but it was probably in the order of about 6 kilometres. So at a decent speed, should have got there in like 10 minutes. So in that 10-minute period, I went unconscious. I don't remember going to the window, to be triaged or anything like that. I think I was out of it by then. And and so I woke up. I'm trying to think how long I was out for. Because they did an induced coma for me, I think. I'm not actually completely sure. But it was a funny thing though. They apparently had videotape of me being completely out of it, like knocked out, unconscious, and getting up and punching the nurse when she tried to give me a needle. I didn't believe it. They showed me. They had security footage. I was only a little kid. I was only 6 years old. Plus I was unconscious. I don't know how that happened, but they had videotape of it. They thought I was faking being unconscious. I really did not like needles. So apparently I punched her in the eye, and she had a black eye over it. And I shouldn't say apparently, because it was caught on video. It was proven. I saw the video. I did it. But my eyes were shut when I did it. I was completely, like I was in a coma. I did that, punched her, went back to bed, and back into my coma. No memory of that whatsoever. And, I have to accept that it did happen. But it sort of didn't feel like it happened. I was like, nah, you guys are making it up. So, anyway, so I was out of it for, I'm not really sure how long. I seem to think it was between 2 and 3 weeks. So it wasn't a ridiculously long coma, but it was quite substantial. I think it was about 17 days. And I might be wrong, but that's my recollection of it. And so yeah, obviously pretty close to death during that time. And the nurse was not very keen on giving me another needle. They basically tied me down. In fact, I think they did tie me down. And they gave me another needle. And they kept me tied down for a number of days. Even though I was in a coma. Like I'm a little kid, 6 years old, tied down. I can't remember what kind of straps or whatever they had on me. I think it was like some black sort of tie sort of thing. It wasn't rope. It was, and it wasn't those things that are nice and comfortable. It was like a black tie, but it was whatever they used in hospitals at the time. And yeah, and so they did that, and then so then I woke up after a number of days. So after I think 17 days. So that was my first coma. I had 3. I've had 3. They were fairly close to each other. So the other 2 were both when I was 7. But it was not really the interesting part. So the interesting part was what I saw when I was in the coma. So to start with, obviously, I was in the car and I could still hear them. But how I could hear them was a little bit different because my eyes were shut, but I could see them. So I could kind of float over them while we were in the car, while they were yelling at each other and driving to the hospital. So I was floating over them and I could see them. I could float all around the car. But I couldn't leave the car. Not sure why that is, but I couldn't leave the car. So I could just go to the front seat, I could see all the speedometer and all that, we were speeding, and all that sort of stuff. But I was aware that, like I could see myself, my eyes were shut. Well, that's interesting. Now when we got to the hospital, again, I didn't wake up to do the triage and all that sort of stuff. And I sort of was aware that, and I didn't see myself punch the nurse. That I wasn't in my body at that point. And so what happened, I actually didn't stay in the hospital to observe all the different things. What I did was I flew. And so my spirit, if you like, but it felt like it was me, and I was able to fly, and I was like, oh, this is great, I can fly. And I flew all the way up to the sky. I wasn't looking down at anybody. I wasn't aware that anybody even existed. And I flew up into the sky, and there were clouds. And up above the clouds, there was a light. It's kind of a yellow light. And it was sort of seemed to be streaming down. So I went up into the clouds and saw the light, and I saw a figure there. And it felt like it was a very big figure. And it was a very male figure. But it kind of looked human, but he had no feet. And it sort of, I was aware that this figure was about at least 1,000 times bigger than me. So, if you're sort of looking at the size differential, and I was quite small for a 6-year-old, but 1,000 times bigger would be like as tall as the tallest building in the world at the time. So as tall as the Empire State Building, probably taller. Probably 2 or 3 times as tall as that. But not as skinny as the Empire State Building, but much, much wider, sort of human proportion. And this was an enormous figure. And I was able to be aware of it. I didn't get particularly close to this figure, but I was close enough that I could tell what it was. And so the figure told me he was God. And not Jesus, not anybody else, just God. Didn't use any names, didn't call himself Allah or Yahweh or any of those names, just God. I said, okay. And he asked me how old I was. And I was 6. Okay. You're a bit young, he said. You know, you're not really meant to be coming up here this young. I explained what happened. And so God told me, no, you're not meant to come up yet. In fact, you're not meant to come up for a very long time. And it was really weird because you think, oh, it'll tell me it's 50 or 70 or just not specify a time. But he actually said 150. Well, no, actually not 150, 155. I was like, what? But people aren't living that long. What's going on? I'm not going to be the oldest person ever to live. It's a bit silly to think that. He said, well, between 153 and 158, maybe 157, 155, that's when you're going to live. And I'm this seems ridiculous. And I was aware the oldest person alive at the time was like 118. And later on we did get the record went out to 122. And I thought, oh, okay, maybe medical will improve things, we'll live a bit longer. But it was very strange to hear that. And that's what I had. And had the conversation and said, you have to do this in your life. And, you haven't done enough. It's only 6 years old. I said, you haven't done enough to die yet. You have to do more in your life. Okay. So it was almost like I hadn't done enough to earn the right to die. So, it was just up there and just saying, well, you're not ready yet. And I never touched God, or never really got close, but I sort of was aware behind him. There were all these spirits. And they're sort of like what I imagine ghosts would look like, sort of flying around behind him. And they were human size. So they looked tiny compared to him. But they actually looked like they were 2 or 3 times bigger than me, so as big as adults would be. And I was able to sort of, and I didn't go close enough. I shouldn't have been able to see them properly. But I was aware of who they were. And there were some of my relatives that I'd met and I was aware of who died. And they were saying hello to me and saying there'll be a place for you when you come, when it's your time. I don't even remember who they were because I've forgotten who they were for a lot of them. But there was like 20 or 30 relatives, and my great-grandmother was there, and I'd never met my great-grandmother. She died before I was born, but she was there, and I knew who she was. So I'd been told about her. Even my great-great-grandmother, who died a long time before I was born, she was there and I knew who she was. And of course my great-grandmother was 98 when she died. And my great-great-grandmother was about 103, so quite long-lived. And there wasn't a very big gap between when the two of them died. And they both died just before I was born. Like my great-great-grandmother died, I think, 7 years before I was born, and my great-grandmother died a year before I was born. So they were there and I was aware of who they were. Even though I'd never met them, I'd seen pictures, people had talked about them, and it felt like I knew them. So there I was, meeting them and meeting different family members who I'd been told about. Some I'd met. There's one of my uncles that had died that I'd met, and another uncle that had died just a few weeks before I was born. So I knew who they were. People had told me about them. But it was really quite interesting to have all these people up there. And like they were able to talk to me, I was able to talk to them. They were able to tell me what it was like. And now I was never told this is heaven. I was never told anything like that. It wasn't, oh, I have to lead a certain type of life. It wasn't like, oh, you're on the wrong track. I wasn't told that at all. I was just told, it's not your time yet. And it was also a thing that they said that, you know, you can't come here early. You know, you're not allowed to hurt yourself to get there or do anything to speed the process up. But nor am I supposed to do anything to slow the process down. So there were all different things, and they were explaining all these different things. So can't go there too early, can't go there late, can't like be on machines to keep yourself alive unnecessarily, and all that sort of stuff. And there were all these rules they told me. But it wasn't like they weren't saying, oh, you've got to change your life. I was 6 years old. And in fact, none of my near-death experiences have had them saying to me, you've got to change your life. None of them. I had that from people that I talked to. They'd often say, oh, you're on the wrong track, you're a bad person. But I never had that in any near-death experiences. And, you know, people that would tell me that were invariably wrong, and they were saying it for their own personal interests, you know, their own manipulations, if you like. So I kind of learned to ignore that. I don't really trust that. But yeah, it was an interesting thing, and it felt like I was there for a very long time. And I never went into the light. I tried to, but they wouldn't let me. I was like, no, let me go in there, at least let me look around. They wouldn't let me. So it's like God was pushing a hand out, and it obviously wasn't a human hand, to sort of not let me go in. I wasn't allowed to just have a look around. Wasn't allowed anything. And I spent the whole of that coma in this place, which I'm calling heaven, but I don't know. I couldn't go inside. And I'm not even sure if my dead relatives were actually outside of heaven, or if they were actually inside and somehow I was able to see just them. And I couldn't see anyone that didn't know. And it was almost like I was visiting them. It's like I was visiting some of my dead relatives. And it felt kind of important for me to tell some of my living relatives that I'd seen my dead relatives. And so they're passing on messages to me. And that seemed to be the purpose of it. And, you know, different ones were sorry for different things they'd done, and some of them wanted to just let them know that they were okay. And, you know, so that was the whole thing. And that was it. And then I felt myself being pulled back into my body. And it happened really quickly. So I don't know how high up I was, but it felt like I was a really long way up. Like, not just up above the clouds, but a long way beyond the clouds, you know. Maybe not all the way to the moon, but maybe halfway there. Sort of, you know, a long way up. And yeah, it sort of was a bit strange. I wasn't clearly aware of exactly where I was, but it felt like a physical place. It didn't feel like, oh, I'd gone into, you know, some made up, imaginary, mythological place. It was a real place. It was a physical place. It wasn't a metaphysical place. It was a real physical place. And God actually looked generally human, but had no feet, no legs, at least nothing that I could see. And the hands were a little bit wrong. The proportions weren't quite right. Had a long beard that covered his face. I don't know if his face was human, but generally had a feeling of kindness about him. And yeah, white hair, white beard. Don't know what his hair normally was. Skin colour, I'm not sure. But it felt like my skin colour. But it also didn't feel like it had to be that. It was, I was quite well aware that God, as he appeared to me, was only appearing in that way because that made me feel comfortable. So it wasn't a physical, essential form. This was more, it was a shape changer. He could change his shape to look whatever made me feel comfortable. And this just was what made me feel comfortable. So, and then, yeah, when it ended, I just felt myself pushed backwards. And I was aware of what was going on. I was pushed back into my body, and you know, God said goodbye, and the different relatives said goodbye and reminded me what I had to tell my living relatives. So that was my first one. Of course, I told my living relatives, and most of them thought I was full of nonsense. My grandfather, who had been diagnosed with prostate cancer and then bone cancer secondary to it, didn't have much long to live, and he believed it. Or he told me he believed it. And he got the messages, and he told me about these people. Some of them I'd never met. Some of them had died before I was born. And he told me about them, and apparently one of them was his father, who died about 20 years beforehand. And well before I was born. And it was interesting, I was seeing people I'd never met before. And some of them I'd never even heard about. Some of them I'd never seen pictures of. And it was interesting that these were all people that had a connection to me. They were blood relatives. There was nobody there that wasn't a relative. And yeah, my grandfather was able to identify some of them. And we tried to pass those on, but a lot of people just said, oh, you just made it up. You just invented it, just imagined it. The only one that really properly believed it was my grandfather. My grandmother did a little bit, but not really to the same level that Granddad did. And, you know, I had people tell me, you know, my sister told me, oh, you don't think you're special, that you can talk to God. But it wasn't really about that. It wasn't about being special. It was just, like, it didn't feel like I was special. It didn't feel like I was selected or anything. It just felt quite ordinary. Like this is what happens to everybody when they die. Not necessarily it's exactly the same for everybody, but that it was just there. And I was aware that there was something behind the figure that I thought of as God, but I couldn't see it. I could see these figures, and I was aware that there were more figures, but I was only allowed to see, or only able to see, the ones that were related to me. And I was aware that behind them there was something that was presumably a physical heaven, but I couldn't see it. I felt that was a bit unfair, really. You know, people had told me what heaven looked like. You know, I'd read the Bible, or at least bits of it, and I should have been able to imagine it, but I couldn't see it. There was nothing that I could see. It was almost like I wasn't allowed to see it. So that was the first near-death experience that I could remember. It was actually the fourth, but as I said, it was only later that I was able to, only when I was like 12 and 13, that I was able to connect with the previous memories. So that was one that was an interesting one. And that was what a near-death experience was for me. Now, some people have told me, well, their near-death experiences were different. And my other ones were different as well. But that was the first one, or at least the first one that I remembered. Actually went fourth. But it was, yeah, that was what it was like. So anyway, just wanted to share that with people there. That's it from me. Bye-bye now.